Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the City of Forest Grove. I welcome you to our afternoon live stream program with Matt Reeder, Extraordinary Oregon. 125 fantastic hikes across the state of Oregon. Before we get started, there I am. I want to thank you all for being here either on YouTube or on Facebook. It's a little different time than we usually have our live streams. Saturday afternoon is not a typical time, but a program about hiking and being outdoors just seems like a good weekend activity. You can watch Matt's presentation and then get outside in this beautiful weather and go explore some of the places that Matt's going to talk about. Matt and I were talking just before we went on. He was actually one of the very last in-person guests that we had in the library before we closed for COVID way back in January of 2020. So it seems like ages ago, but we're really excited to have him back to talk about his new book, Extraordinary Oregon, and also a new edition of a book he published right before COVID. That would be this one, PDX Hiking 365. This is the older edition, so there is a new edition that's out. Matt is also the author of Off the Beaten Trail. This is my first edition, or the first edition. This is my copy, and as you can see, it's pretty well used. The new edition is out in my car, which is where a book like this should be. So both of these books are published through Ruddy Hill Press, and Matt can talk about how you can get copies of all of these books, as well as his new book, Extraordinary Oregon. So I'm going to bring Matt into the stream.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to have you joining us again. As we said, we were reminiscing about your in-person appearance at the library way back in January of 2020. It seems like ages ago.
It really does. It really does.
And you were saying it was your last in-person appearance before COVID.
It was definitely so. Yeah, it was a great time. I really enjoyed that presentation a great deal. We had a packed audience, and it was a very rainy night in early January, and it's just everything went really well.
Yeah.
And then 2020 happened.
and then yeah. Well, we're glad to have you back, and really excited to find out more about your new book, Extraordinary Oregon, as well as the new edition of PDX Hiking 365. So I'm going to bring your slides in. I'm going to back out of the stream, and then I'll see you when you're done.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
All right, see you, Matt.
So welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Matt Reeder, and I'm here to talk about my new book, 125 Fantastic Hikes Across the State of Oregon. So you can see I chose Crater Lake as my image for the cover of this presentation. And to me, it really signifies what is so extraordinary about this state. So Bob introduced me a little bit, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my background. For those of you who don't know me, I was born in central Illinois, and I moved to Oregon when I was 7. And growing up out here, I did a lot of hiking with my stepdad, and we went and visited places all over the state. So we went to Crater Lake, and we went to the Wallowas, and we went all over Eastern Oregon to Hell's Canyon. And we lived in Salem, so most of our hikes, our day hikes and overnight camping trips were in the Mount Jefferson area. And I really grew up loving the outdoors and exploring. And my stepdad even gave me the free rein to explore on my own when we would go camping. So I would go solo hiking even when I was 13, 14 at times. And I really loved the experience. And so when I was 16, we moved back to Illinois to help take care of family members who were sick. And so I went to college in Illinois, but Oregon stayed with me. And after college, I moved back out here. And this time I'm settled in Portland. And I've been here ever since, with 1 year in France for work accepted, because I also love the French language and teach the French language in my day job. So with that in mind, over the last 20 years, I've explored a gigantic amount of Oregon. And over the years, I started working on hiking guidebooks. And my first book, which Bob mentioned, was a book called Off the Beaten Trail. It was published in 2013, the first edition was, and it covers obscure hikes and hikes not covered in other guidebooks. And I published a second edition in 2019. And then, of course, for those of you who are from the area, know that we've had a series of absolutely devastating fires that have closed a lot of places that I very much loved and that all of us love. And with those closures in mind, I'm not planning on publishing another edition of this book. But I am very proud of it. It was my first book, my first writing project. And I still love every one of the hikes in both editions. So I'll be glad to talk about that later if anybody wants to know. As I mentioned, I grew up in Salem. And, excuse me. So for me, the Mount Jefferson area and the Opal Creek area is like my home away from home. This book was my second book. I really wanted to write a book that would represent the side of that area that I knew that isn't necessarily well known, because many guidebooks for the Central Oregon Cascades and for that region would only cover 5 or 10 hikes in that area. But there is a vast trail network in the areas around Opal Creek, Olallie Lake, Mount Jefferson, and so on. And I did literally more than 100 hikes in that area alone and wrote about them. And so the final product was a book called 101 Hikes in the Majestic Mount Jefferson region. Unfortunately, many of the hikes in this book were damaged in the 2020 fires. And so some may never reopen. The Opal Creek area in particular suffered greatly, was hit very, very hard. And some of those hikes may never reopen. And the area looks very different than how it used to look. That being said, I am planning on writing a new edition of this book for 2026. To celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the first edition, and by that point, many hikes should be reopened. I also plan on spending a lot more time in this area just because I love it. It's home for me. No other place is home for me quite in the same way as exploring the Mount Jefferson region. So that was my one of my favorite projects ever, and something I'm immensely proud of. But while I was working on that, most of that area I could only visit in the summer and fall. So while I was working on that, I would go places in the winter, and people would always ask me, like, well, where should I go this weekend? And even in the middle of winter, people would ask me that. And eventually I just got the idea, well, why don't I write a book about hiking that's where to go by season, not and by month, not by where should I go in August. Most hiking guidebooks tend to cover hiking as though it's summer year-round, and that's not the case. I go hiking year-round. I hike as much in January as I do in July most years. And for me, it was, what's the best hike I can do right now? And so with that in mind, I wrote this book, which covers 10 hikes for every month of the year from January to December. And I created it, and it's called PDX Hiking. And I have a new edition out, which covers hikes that I think I might have just neglected or forgotten about in the first edition. But also, I needed to replace some of the hikes that burned badly in 2020 and 2021 also. There were a couple other fires in 2021. And so PDX Hiking 365, I have a new edition of it out. And I very much love this project. And people always come to me and say, I never thought about where to go in the winter, and now I just love going and exploring all these places you wrote about, because I didn't think that that's what I could do right then. So I'm very happy with this book, and I'm very happy with the second edition, and I'll be glad to talk about that later too. But y'all are here to see my presentation about Extraordinary Oregon. And this was my pandemic project. I started outlining this book in the summer of 2019. I decided to take 2019 off from writing and from researching. And so I did a lot of really fun, cool adventures across the state of Oregon. And I thought over the course of the summer, it would be cool to write a book about the whole state. Well, then in 2020, the pandemic happened and I found myself unable to travel. In those early days of the pandemic, we really weren't sure what was okay, what wasn't, where you could go, what was open, what you should be doing with people. And so I did a lot of research on this project solo. I explored the whole state, crisscrossed the whole state, drove something like 20,000 miles working on this book just in Oregon. And the result was literally hundreds of hikes that I researched. And so I was thinking about doing, oh, maybe I should do 100 or 101 to kind of tie into 101 hikes in the Majestic Mount Jefferson region. And I couldn't cut it at 100, and I couldn't cut it at 101. So the result was Extraordinary Oregon, 125 fantastic hikes across the state of Oregon. And I want to talk about some of my favorites as this presentation goes along. The book is organized from Northwest Oregon to Southeast Oregon. I actually thought about doing it the opposite, but I decided that was a little too cute. But so I'll be starting along the coast and working my way south and east as the presentation goes along to follow how I organize these hikes in my book. So I want to show you a map here. The sections all go south to east. So the first part of the book starts up by Astoria and works its way all the way down to the California border in the coast and the Coast Range. The second section covers the Willamette Valley, so basically Portland down to Eugene and Forest Grove to the west out to about the edge of the gorge to the east. And then the third section is the Columbia River Gorge. The fourth section is the Northern Oregon Cascades, so basically Mount Hood. The fifth section is the Central Oregon Cascades, so from Mount Jefferson down to about Diamond Peak and Waldo Lake, if you know where that area is. It's more accessible from Eugene, even though it goes south. So down to about here. Section 6 is Southern Oregon, which includes some of the mountains here that are more accessible from the east, as well as the mountains out to about Klamath Falls, roughly. Section 7 is the Central Oregon High Desert, so covering the Deschutes River, down into the high desert here, including Newberry Crater, and also the Painted Hills, places like that. Section 8 is Northeast Oregon, so from Pendleton east to Hell's Canyon across the Wallowas. And Section 9 is Southeast Oregon, so everything from John Day south to the Nevada border, and everything east to the Idaho border. Oregon is a magnificent state, and you can never run out of things to do. And that was the reason why I found it difficult to limit this book in any way, shape, or form. So hence we have 125 hikes in my book. And to start, I'd like to talk about the Oregon coast. So the Oregon coast is truly a magnificent place. You have, starting at Astoria, driving south all the way to Brookings, it's 300 something miles of highway and US 101. And every square inch of beach in Oregon is public land. That is due to laws passed by Oswald West and later codified under Tom McCall. And so with every square inch of beach being public land, there is an endless wealth of places to explore along the beach. But Oregon coast isn't just the coast, it's also the Coast Range, the mountains that separate the Oregon coast from the Willamette Valley and from the southern valleys near Medford. I could have written an entire book just on the coast and Coast Range, and such projects have been done. And so I wanted to really highlight some of my favorite places and also some places that I thought weren't necessarily as well known. So in this section, I have a mixture of really, really, really well-known places and places that are very obscure. And I was very happy to explore them and present them to you. So for each section, I will be highlighting one hike that I thought really represented what I was trying to do in this book. And with that in mind, the first hike that I'll present to you is a place called Blacklock Point. One thing I tried to do with this book was present hikes to the nearest town. So the nearest town here is Port Orford. In the book, directions start at Port Orford, which is a town on the coast between Coos Bay and Gold Beach and Brookings. So it's quite a bit south of here. I discovered over the course of working on this book that I really, really, really love the Southern Coast. And more than half the hikes in my coast and coast range section are south of Coos Bay. I really, really, really love this part of the state. And this hike is really neat because you get to hike along the beach, pass a waterfall that goes directly into the ocean, onto the beach and then into the ocean. You get to hike above sea cliffs, and you get to pass all sorts of wonderful, beautiful flowers that bloom in June. I did this hike in June of last year, so the flowers should be excellent right now. And eventually, after about 4.5 miles, you end up at this headland right here, jutting out into the ocean called Blacklock Point. There's no easy and short way to get there, really. So for the most part, there is a shorter way to get there, but it's very muddy and hard to follow. But this is the best way to get there. And it's an adventure, I guess I should say. It involves a lot of different elements, including the forest, the beach, the cliffs, flowers. And when you get there, you might have it to yourself. I sat on the headland in the photo and had a very early lunch and marveled at how happy I was and how well I'd chosen this hike. It's more than 9 miles out and back. Not a lot of elevation gain. The major thing with this hike is that if you're going to hike along the beach at all, you need to check your tide tables. As with any hike on the coast that follows the beach, you need to be able to check your tide tables and make sure that you can actually walk along the beach you're planning to hike along. Also, you need to make sure when the tide comes in that you have an out so you can hike inland and get away from the high tide. So if you're doing this hike, you'll have to check and make sure, should you hike along the beach on the way there, on the way back, or is it just not going to work out at all due to when the tide comes in? I managed to catch the beach stretch at low tide, and it was perfect. And that was one of my favorite beaches I've hiked on in Oregon. So this is truly a wonderful hike and is a really great way to kick off or end a vacation to the Southern Oregon coast. And it's one of my favorite hikes in the state. I'm really glad I did it, and I can't wait to go back. There are a lot of other hikes in the coast and coast range, including hikes to waterfalls, hikes to secret beaches like I just described, hikes to headlands, hikes to wildflower-covered mountains in the coast and coast range. And this is one of my favorites. And I hope you all get the chance to do it sometime. And, it's worth doing again and again and again. So I can't wait to go back. As I said, I could have written an entire book just about the coast and coast range, but we'll move eastward and talk about some things that are closer to home. So the Willamette Valley is where most of the state's population lives. And because of that, the valley is far more developed than any other part of the state. And so in return, there are the fewest hikes of any section of my book. There are only 6 hikes in my book in the Willamette Valley. The idea behind this book was to talk about extraordinary hikes. And most hikes in the valley are pleasant or nice or even lovely, but they aren't necessarily extraordinary. Silver Falls is the most extraordinary hike in the valley, period. And yes, that's in this book. But I didn't want to talk about Silver Falls because that's a place that so many of us have been. My parents had their wedding reception there. My wife and I had our wedding reception at Silver Falls. So I wanted to talk about something that was a little less known. When you hike through the valley, you often get grassy hills that have flowers in the spring, and you get really pleasant streams that flow through little canyons, not impressive canyons, but little canyons. And you also have small waterfalls in some places, and you have pockets of old growth and maybe something else such as a neat bridge or a little wildflower meadow somewhere. There are a lot of really cool little hikes, but there aren't a lot of extraordinary hikes. One hike that I really love that it's extraordinary is a place called Eagle Fern Park, which is very close to Estacada. So from Portland, it's about a 30-minute drive. From Forest Grove, it'd be about 45 to 50, depending on how you get there. But in 1.7 miles, you get to hike over a suspension bridge into a small pocket of really, truly impressive old growth forest. And from there, up through the old growth and then down back along the river, which it's a creek. It's along Eagle Creek, which is not the same one that's in the gorge, different Eagle Creek. But if you go there in the winter, it really more resembles a river. And you get to see all of this and hike through huge ferns and the fog. If you manage to get there in the winter, it's very foggy often in the winter. And then back again in 1.7 miles. It's truly one of the neatest little parks you'll find anywhere. And it's so close to home. I like to go to Eagle Fern Park in the winter on sunny days, particularly in December and January when there just isn't a whole lot of daylight. There's not a whole lot of time. And you can go do this beautiful little hike and be home in time to watch a football game or go Christmas shopping or just have a cup of coffee and sit in your favorite chair and read in the afternoon. That's the wonderful thing about this hike. Other hikes I included in the Willamette Valley include one of my favorite hikes in Forest Park, Powell Butte, which is near my house in southeast Portland, Silver Falls, and a few other things closer to Eugene. But if you asked me to name my favorite valley hike and Silver Falls wasn't possible, this would be my favorite. And it truly is a great place to go and just explore for a couple hours on a cold morning in the winter. So I love the valley. And I also wanted to highlight things that were maybe a little different than people were expecting. And that was the same case with the Columbia River Gorge, which I'll move to next. The Columbia River Gorge is a very unique place in the United States. It's very close to Portland, so it's very close to a major city. And it is a huge river, one of the most impressive rivers in the entire United States. And it flows through the Cascade Range, which means that essentially it's a river at sea level flowing through a mountain range. And as a result, has very unique weather. In the summer, it's just like everywhere else. But in the winter, it rains enormously in the Central Gorge near Cascade Locks. But as you head east, it rains less and less and less until you arrive at the slide and the picture on the slide, which is the Deschutes River, the same one that flows through Central Oregon. The Deschutes River empties into the Columbia about 15 miles east of the Dalles in an area that is essentially desert. It is very close to being officially desert. And this is an easy drive from Portland, just 90 minutes due east on I-84. And so for me, the Columbia River Gorge, it was fun to highlight places that were effectively rainforest, and then places that were mountains at the very top of the gorge, and then places that were more dry on the eastern side of the gorge that had fantastic spring flowers, and then the Deschutes River, which is essentially desert. All of these places are an easy drive from home. And I have written about the gorge extensively in my other books. So it was a challenge to really limit it to what are the most extraordinary hikes in the gorge. And I arrived at what is the most extraordinary hike in the gorge, period. And that's Eagle Creek. This is the famous Eagle Creek that where the fire along Eagle Creek started in 2017. And it's also a place that has more waterfalls than you can even count. And it's a place that the trail was blasted out of the basalt, out of the rock. So it's right along the edge of a cliff for a lot of the hikes. So if you're afraid of heights, this is perhaps not the best hike for you. I have been to Eagle Creek many, many, many times. It was one of the first hikes I ever did in the gorge. But I have since gone back a few times after the 2017 fire, since it's been reopened, and I've discovered that the fire was not all bad. Some areas burned badly, but some areas look just about the same as they always have. And even the parts of the trail that did burn, the burn actually opened up more views of waterfalls in the canyon that you could never see before the fire. I also have discovered that if you keep going you can make it all the way to the last waterfall in the canyon, which is a waterfall called 7 Mile Falls, which you see in the picture. And it's a fairly easy hike if you're in shape. And by the time you get this far up the canyon, you don't have a whole lot of people. So for me, I really have enjoyed going all the way up into the canyon, seeing all the waterfalls, which are all still beautiful, marveling at the scenery that's changed since the fire that started in 2017, marveling at what looks the same, and as always, marveling at the foresight of the trail builders to build a trail in such a precarious location. It's one of Oregon's most extraordinary hikes. And if you've never done it, and if you're not afraid of heights, and even if you are, I did it while I was very afraid of heights, and I'm glad I did. It's something that every Oregonian who loves hiking should hike at least once in their lives. And if you haven't been, I strongly urge you to go, but perhaps wait until the fall, because in the summer it gets really crowded. But it's lovely in the fall, and it's quite lovely in the winter, provided it's not icy. But there are a lot of wonderful hikes in the gorge, and I highlighted some of my favorites in this book. When you think of the Northern Oregon Cascades, just south of the gorge, you think of Mount Hood. And the hike that I'll be presenting is about Mount Hood. But the Northern Oregon Cascades, which to me is everything within 30 miles north to south of Mount Hood and east to west, you also have beautiful lakes, ancient forests, flower-spangled hills east of Mount Hood. You have rushing rivers and streams and waterfalls, and you have Mount Hood at the center of it all. And the hike that I want to present to you has maybe my favorite view of Mount Hood, and that's Gnarl Ridge. Gnarl Ridge is east of Mount Hood, so it's about a half hour south of Hood River, or about 5 miles north of Meadows ski area if you ski. And this is a corner of the mountain where you have the largest glacier on Mount Hood, I think, which is the Newton-Clark Glacier, which you see in the picture. And the Newton-Clark Glacier dominates the entire eastern face of the mountain. If you've ever wanted to see a glacier up close, this is a great place to see one, because you can actually, the picture doesn't really do it justice. The view is truly magnificent. And to get there, it's a difficult hike, but no more difficult than a lot of other things that people think are pretty easy, fairly easy or moderate. Also, along the way, you could pass through Elk Meadows, which is a lovely place. But really, to me, Gnarl Ridge is all about the view of Mount Hood. There are campsites scattered about off the trail. This is the Timberline Trail, too. So if you're hiking the whole Timberline around Mount Hood, you'll pass by this spot for sure. This is also the point for me where I guess I should say that one thing about this book is that it's all day hikes. There are plenty of places in this book that are backpackable, but I decided to only focus on day hikes because, to me, I most enjoy doing day hiking. I love backpacking. I love long road trips, but I love being able to go on a day hike and then come home and have dinner and sleep in my bed and revel on what a great day it was. So Gnarl Ridge, while it's part of the Timberline Trail, is also really nice to go do in a day and then come home. And to me, this is the best view of Mount Hood that you can get for not a gigantic amount of effort for most hikers. So I could have included 10 hikes on Mount Hood in this book, and I decided that I would try to only include 3 or 4. I've written about Mount Hood a lot elsewhere, but this is one of my favorites, and I think it will be one of yours too. If you haven't been, I highly recommend it. And the time to go is coming up in about a month. It should be open from mid-July through about mid-October. So, with Mount Hood is the Northern Oregon Cascades. So we're going to move to the Central Oregon Cascades, which is Mount Jefferson, Central Oregon, the Three Sisters, and then down to Diamond Peak and Waldo Lake, which are a lot further south, but most easily accessed from Eugene. The picture you see is the Glacial Tarn, which is a lake that is created by snowmelt. And it's a glacial lake near the summit of South Sister, Oregon's 3rd tallest peak, and the southernmost of the Three Sisters. But I covered a lot of Mount Jefferson in this area and a lot of other parts of Central Oregon, including wildflower meadows and waterfalls and the majestic and magnificent Metolius River, as well as the Three Sisters. And the hike that I'm going to talk about is in the Three Sisters Wilderness. But also, I want to point out that there are 125 hikes in this book. 25 of those hikes are in the Central Oregon Cascades. Pretty much this entire region could be a national park if there was a will to make it so. But I'm glad it's not, because then we can keep it all to ourselves. That's kind of a joke, just a bit. But the hike I want to point out is a place called Tam MacArthur Rim, which is accessed from the town of Sisters, and a very easy drive south of Sisters. And in fact, right now it is currently closed because the road is being worked on, but will reopen sometime in July. And which is good, because this area is still buried under snow. So hopefully the road will be fixed by the time the area melts out. But so Tam MacArthur Rim is what's called a fault escarpment. It's a large ridge that's like a sheer cliff that extends east from Broken Top, which is the mountain you see in my photo, and continues several miles to the east. And you can, because it's a very easy thing to see, you can see it from almost anywhere in Central Oregon. Especially, you can even see it from Timberline Lodge if you know where to look. But this trail starts at a very high elevation and continues climbing. And eventually you'll end up at some magnificent viewpoints at the edge of the rim. But if you keep going and continue west towards Broken Top on what become some unofficial trails, you'll eventually end up at a lake that is called No Name Lake, which is a glacial lake at the base of Broken Top. And from there, you'll end up at this incredible viewpoint of Broken Top, where you can look south 100 miles into the Cascades and look north 100 miles to the Three Sisters, to Mount Jefferson, to Mount Hood, and even to Mount Adams on clear days. One of the most incredible viewpoints in the state. So I made a mistake with my animation here, with my slide. The easy option, which just takes you to the viewpoint, is only 5 miles round trip. And it's very well graded, but you'll still find yourself huffing and puffing because you're at such a high elevation. This is one of the highest elevation hikes in the entire Oregon Cascades that doesn't involve summiting a mountain. And as a result, you'll want to take your time here. This hike is very backpackable. There are plenty of campsites, but to do so, whether you're going for a day or overnight, you will need to secure a limited entry permit. And I have all the details for that on my website, in my book, and I'll be glad to explain it more in depth. But essentially the process is you have to go to recreation.gov, where the permits are, and permits are available at the beginning of the season, but also a week in advance. This is one of the tougher permits to get, but it's worth it if you can. And for days, if you're just going for a day, it's not terribly difficult, but you will need to make sure you reserve your permit in advance. There are so many incredible hikes in the Cascades, in the Central Cascades, and this might still be my favorite. This or Jefferson Park, which is the north face of Mount Jefferson, and I would talk about that if it were open, but unfortunately it's not right now. Southern Oregon is coming up next, and the Southern Oregon Cascades are a magnificent place, an amazing place, and I talked about Crater Lake a little earlier. But Southern Oregon is more than just Crater Lake. It's also the Cascades, and it's also the canyons and valleys in Southern Oregon as well. Here in the photo is the Illinois River Trail, which is best accessed from Grants Pass. And so this is actually technically in the Coast Range, but access is much easier from the valleys of Medford and Grants Pass, which is why it's in this section and not in the Coast Range. But so in this section, you also have Crater Lake, obviously, and Mount Thielsen, and some of parts of the Soda Mountain Wilderness and other places that are really a unique environment. You've got different flowers from here. You have different mountains. You have different geology. It's very unique and very beautiful. And I spent a lot of time in Southern Oregon, and I wished I could have spent a lot more. There were so many hikes I wanted to talk about in my presentation. And I decided the one that I really wanted to present the most is a place called Sucker Gap and Swan Mountain. This is a really beautiful hike. The access is from the town of Jacksonville, and you drive south along the Applegate River until you reach a trailhead that is only a quarter mile from the California border. I made it a point in this book to only include hikes in the state of Oregon. So a lot of my favorite hikes in the Columbia River Gorge, for example, are actually on the Washington side of the gorge. I did not include those. Only hikes in the state of Oregon. And as a result, this is a fun one because this is the only hike in this book that leaves the state. The trailhead is in Oregon, the destination's in Oregon, but to get there, you have to hike into California for a mile, then hike back out of California. It's right on the border. And it's kind of neat. There's no sign marking the state line. There's no line or anything. There are no fences. But as you hike south, you can kind of feel that you've left Oregon. And as you hike back north around the mountain that it's skirting, you can kind of feel that you're back in Oregon. And you end up at this beautiful place called Sucker Gap, which is a huge meadow with a shelter surrounded by enormous incense cedars, 6, 7, 8 feet thick. And that's the destination for the moderate hike. If you want to keep going, you'll end up at this place called Swan Mountain, which has an incredible view, primarily of California, in the mountains in California, including Mount Shasta, but also north into Oregon, into the Cascades, and other parts of the Siskiyou Mountains. It's a very interesting area with different flowers than you would see here, although in the photo you just see paintbrush, which is everywhere. And the geology is different. You have the rocks are different colors. They have different geological origins. And yet you're still in Oregon. And that's just due to a coincidence. That's just due to where the state line is. But it is very much an Oregon hike. And this is a really beautiful area that you can explore because there's a vast trail system here. Southern Oregon isn't like anywhere else. And I could have written an entire book just on Southern Oregon and been perfectly happy. But this is extraordinary Oregon, which is the state as a whole. And so now we're going to take a long trip from Southern Oregon to Central Oregon, a long drive into the Central Oregon High Desert, which is where you also find some fascinating geological areas such as Blue Basin and the Painted Hills and John Day fossil beds. This also covers the Deschutes River Canyon south of the gorge, and it covers the high desert east of Bend. West of Bend is Central Oregon Cascades, and all the way down into the mountains between Klamath Falls and Lakeview. It's a huge area. And of all these hikes, every single one of them is beautiful and desert-like. There are slot canyons, there are wildflower meadows, there are beautiful hikes along the Deschutes River. And of this latter, that's the hike I wanted to talk about here. Scout Camp is a beautiful, beautiful loop that starts at the Crooked River Ranch area near Terrebonne, dives down into the canyon of the Deschutes River, which you see below in the photo, and then back out. It's a little late for it this year. Typically, you would do this hike in the spring for the wildflowers, or you can do it in the fall, and it's beautiful in the fall. I don't recommend it during the summer, though, because it gets very hot here. It's the Deschutes Canyon. It's desert or high desert. I would avoid this hike in the summer, but keep it in mind for the fall or for next year. But it's a 2.3 mile hike. Just as I talked about with Eagle Fern Park, this is a great place to go and get a beautiful hike in and then still be home in time to do something else. Or if you're traveling, it's a great hike to get in on your way into Central Oregon or on your way out of Central Oregon, if you're traveling there. And the cliffs in Scout Camp, not just the canyon, but the cliff walls are rainbow colored, orange, purple, pink, yellow. It's a beautiful place. And pictures don't really do it justice. Central Oregon as a whole, I love. And the high desert of Central Oregon, to me, was a place that I kept going back to again and again and again. And there are a lot of hikes in this section of book in Central Oregon. Moving on to Northeast Oregon, we're talking the Wallowas, we're talking Hell's Canyon. I spent a lot of time in Northeast Oregon working on this project, multiple 8, 9, 10-day trips. And I did a lot of the Wallowas. And the thing with the Wallowas is that it's an amazingly beautiful area. It's 6-hour drive from Portland. So from Forest Grove, probably closer to 6.5, 7. And once you get there, you don't want to leave. It's such a beautiful area. The mountains are so serene. It's referred to as Oregon, Switzerland, and it kind of looks like the Alps. But once you get there, it's hard to leave. But the other problem with getting there is that the Wallowas are a place best seen on backpacking trips. And because I decided to focus only on day hikes, that was the challenge of writing about this area. Hell's Canyon was the same, which is also in this section. So the hike that I chose to talk about was Ice Lake. And Ice Lake is a long hike, but it's one of the best hikes in the state. I did this hike for the first time when I was 12. I made a mistake with my stepdad. We were trying to figure out a good hike to do. And we decided on this, but we didn't know how long it was. And so at Trailhead, we started hiking and we saw the sign that said 8. And I thought, oh, wow, 8 miles round trip. That's perfect. No, it was 8 miles one way. And we didn't realize that until about halfway through the hike. And this is 1993. This is before GPSs. This is before, I think I was 12 and didn't really totally understand how far we were going to go. But on the way up, we passed waterfalls. We passed views of the mountains. We passed flowers. And my stepdad had to scold me because I wanted to turn around about a mile before the lake. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. And we didn't turn around. We made it to the lake, and it was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever been. In the mountains in the background are Matterhorn and Sacagawea, the 2 highest peaks in Northeast Oregon. And then we had to turn around after only a half hour or so because we had to make it back. We got back to the truck, and I drank an entire 2-liter bottle of Dr. Pepper. And we went and found a different campsite, and we cooked up steaks. And I went to bed about 7:30 that night. That's how tired I was. I was 12. But ever since then, I've returned to Ice Lake about once every 5 or 6 years. And so I went back during the wildfires of 2020. And this was the time when the entire state was covered in smoke. But we managed to catch find the one place in the state that wasn't smoky. It was high up in the Wallowas above the smoke. And my wife and I had a wonderful backpacking trip there, though I've done this hike as a day hike the other times I've been. And it was really, truly fun to just explore the lake, go look for hidden waterfalls, and just sit by the lake and relax. It's one of the most perfect places in the state. And whether you're going for a day or for 3 or 4 days, it's just a gorgeous place and one of the funnest hikes in the entire state. And my favorite hike in the Wallowas. And that's saying something because there are some really amazing hikes in the Wallowas. So we've got one area left, and that's Southeast Oregon. In the photos you see here, this is actually the Owyhee Canyonlands, which is a very difficult place to explore. I featured one hike in the Owyhee Canyonlands in my book because all the others are too much for most people. But Southeast Oregon is Steens Mountain, the Owyhee Canyonlands, and also the canyons and meadows and forests in this area. There is the impression that it's all desert, and it's not all desert. Actually, some of it's desert, some of it is desert-like, and some of it is actually foothills and mountains like you would see elsewhere in Oregon. And that was the fun thing for me because I hadn't spent much time in Southeast Oregon before I started working on this project. And as I went along, I discovered that I really loved it, and I kept wanting to go back and back and back, and I did. So the hike that I wanted to talk about in Southeast Oregon is on the east side of Steens Mountain, and it's a place called Pike Creek. Pike Creek is one of the coolest hikes anywhere in Oregon. You start out, if you look in the background, you can see the playa of the Alvord Desert. You start out at the edge of a desert, an actual desert, the driest place in Oregon. But you're hiking up into a canyon on the east side of Steens Mountain. And Steens Mountain is a giant fault block mountain of 9,700 feet tall. So Steens Mountain gets a decent amount of moisture, more than people would expect, because any storms that are coming that way dump all their moisture on Steens Mountain, which is why the Alvord Desert just east of there is so dry. Almost no moisture makes it to the Alvord. But hiking into Pike Creek, you're starting in the desert and hiking up into an increasingly lush areas just below the summit cliffs of Steens Mountain. So you'll pass an old mine, you'll pass really cool rock formations and really fantastic spring flowers, and eventually you'll arrive in the heart of a canyon deep below the summit cliffs of Steens Mountain. When I went, there was still snow streaking down from the summit and adding a lot of water into the creek. It was really, really, really beautiful and very unique. Southeast Oregon in general is very unique and not very well traveled, and really makes for a fun experience. And I cannot wait to go back here again and again and again. I love Southeast Oregon so much. But with all of that, there's 125 hikes in extraordinary Oregon. And every one of these, for the most part, you can do with a good car. With even a Prius could do about 95 to 100 of these hikes. And I know because I had a Prius up until a few years ago. But the most important thing is you need a functional car. Make sure your car is in full 100% working order before you leave the house. Make sure your tires are properly inflated. Make sure you have a tire repair kit or a spare tire, any one of those things. Make sure you have good rain gear. I cannot stress this enough. Good rain gear is an absolute must, and not just on the wet side of Oregon, but also the dry side. On the dry side, when you get caught in a rainstorm, often there's not as much tree cover to protect you. So make sure you have good rain gear. The 10 essentials, you've probably heard about plenty, but I'm going to put in another plug. Make sure you have the 10 essentials. Also, do not rely on your phone to bail you out of an emergency. Always make sure it's charged. Always make sure you have an idea of where it is. But you might not have phone service a lot of places you go. So make sure you know what you're doing and don't rely on your phone to bail you out, because you might not have service. Always let someone know where you're going and when you plan on returning. The people you see on the news, they often make that mistake. They don't tell people where they're going. And unfortunately, that's how they end up getting lost. Something happens to them, they hurt themselves. Nobody knows where to look for them. If something happens to you and you've made a plan and told somebody where you're going and when you plan on being back, they know if something happened to you, they'll know they'll know to call the authorities, and they'll also know when you left, and that'll give them a good idea of where to find you. And last but not least, of course, remember to have fun. Hiking is fun. Hiking is gloriously fun. You get to hang out with friends or go solo and have some great me time. You get to go see the outdoors. You get exercise. You get to eat basically whatever you want when you do it. And you get fresh air and sunshine and get to be out in the elements and feel something deeply primal and spiritual. It's wonderful. And that's why I choose to continue to write about it. That's why I choose to go and explore on my free time and whenever I can. So it's lots of fun, and I love it so much. So I wasn't sure how people were able to ask questions. Bob, maybe you can chime in and see if there are any questions.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
That was great. I was writing furiously, taking notes.
Yay!
And
this is the first time I've ever done one of these remotes, so I wasn't sure exactly.
Yeah.
But
well, the great thing is, even if you didn't get everything the first time through, this program, like all of our live stream programs, is archived on our YouTube channel.
Yay.
So you can go there and watch again and again and again. Because I kind of was, there are a couple I missed. So so I'm going to take advantage of our own platform technology to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
And I feel like the great thing about having Matt on is that, you can't have a better person to recommend not only the hikes that cover the diversity of our state, but also just like pinpoint specific hikes within those different regions. And because there's so much, and there are just so many different places to go, having kind of that choice option, and to say, this is, like, out of this entire region, this is the one hike that just really resonated with me, I think is so great. And one of the reasons I was so happy when you contacted me about doing another program. So thank you. I'm
You're
like
welcome.
I said, I'm just furiously writing here. Yeah, so if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, either on YouTube or Facebook, and we can get to them. I posted a couple of links during the program.
Okay.
I posted a link to a page that has the 10 Essentials infographic that you shared. So folks who would like to get a copy of that infographic, which I think is a really good one. And I also posted a link to Ready Hill Press. So if anybody wants to order a copy of the book, the link is right there, and they can do it from your publisher. And there are also other access to Matt's other books is on that site as well. So, so take advantage of that by all means, and order those books.
It means a lot to me, but I'm just happy to talk hiking in general.
Yeah. I was telling Matt before we started, I ordered my copy of Extraordinary Oregon from my favorite independent bookstore. It still hasn't reached me yet, but however you get it, support Matt. Go through his site, go through
offthebeatentrailpdx.com.
Yep. And get all of them. They're great.
Thank you.
So,
and I want to thank you for inviting me. I know I reached out to you, but you didn't have to say yes. So I want to thank you for inviting me and helping to set this up. And I really enjoy doing things online. I mean, in my day job, I teach online through Zoom. So this is fun for me. It's fun for me to be able to look out and imagine seeing all of your faces. And I really want to thank everybody who showed. If I didn't thank you already, I want to thank everybody who showed up to this presentation, everybody watching on Facebook and YouTube, and everybody watching on Facebook and on YouTube in the future. So thank you all for coming and watching.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about this project. I mean, one of the things that really struck me is how incredibly diverse the state of Oregon is in terms of geology, in terms of biology, and I mean, I have my favorite parts of the state. I really do. There are places that are just very near and dear to me, and I think folks who don't travel a lot around the state, it's easy to forget how amazing this place is. It just is really remarkable. And as you're going through each of these different regions, it's almost like you're in a completely different place, but all of those things are contained within our border.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, as you were researching this and as you were collecting these, was there a part of the state that kind of surprised you, or that sort of
Southern Oregon?
Southern Oregon.
I had spent less time in Southern Oregon than anywhere else. I'd been to Southeast Oregon less than Southern Oregon, but when I'd been to Southeast Oregon, I'd spent like more focused time in Southeast Oregon, I guess, if that makes sense. But I'd only ever driven through Southern Oregon on my way to California, which we have been to California several times. My wife's family is from California, so we like to go down there. But I'd never really spent any time hiking in Southern Oregon. My first ever hike was at Crater Lake when I was 7, but like I'd never really spent much time down there. And I found myself just being really intrigued by like the mixture of terrain and the mixture of biomes and the mixture of trees from Northern Oregon and Southern Oregon and California all mixed together, and how their coast mountains were different than the coast mountains I was used to visiting, and how their coast mountains, actually the coast range, like I mentioned, the Illinois River, which technically is in the coast range, it flows into the Rogue River not far from the Pacific, but it was dry. I was very surprised by that. It was like it was in its own rain shadow created by the mountains that are there.
Hmm.
And I just didn't know. I didn't know what to expect. And you can read about a place, but not really know what to expect. And every single hike I did down there surprised the heck out of me. I just,
Mm.
I, I kept wanting to go down there. And unfortunately, I only had included 12 hikes from that section in my book because it's had a rough time. I mean, they've had a lot of fires.
Hmm.
And there were a lot of instances in which I was working on something where either it was 100 degrees and I couldn't make it down there, or they were having massive amounts of smoke from fires in California, and I wasn't going to have it. Was not going to be able to do anything that was good for me,
Hmm.
really. Or I just, I would make. I mean, I made plans to go down there, and some things I couldn't do because I'd chosen to go too late in the year, and it was too wet and cold.
Hmm.
But everything I did down there was just so obscenely beautiful, and it made me want to go back again and again and again.
Hmm. Well, uh, I know what you mean when you talk about just the sort of different look and feel. A couple of years ago, we did the Mount Ashland Trail, and you reach a point where you can look and see Mount Shasta, and just looking across the border, there's something different about it.
Yeah,
I can't quite
yeah,
put my finger on it, but it is different, and just stunningly beautiful,
yeah.
absolutely gorgeous.
I actually included a variation on that in my book. It's a place called Siskiyou Peak, which
Mm-hmm.
the access is via Mount Ashland, but you go around Mount Ashland a little bit, and Siskiyou Peak is another peak on that same ridge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that way, I mean, you get out, you're on a piece of the PCT, and you're at looking south into California at Mount Shasta, and also the Siskiyou Peaks and mountains in that region. But then you're still in Oregon, and you can look north and see Mount McLaughlin, and you can see the peaks that comprise the rim of Crater Lake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's really a beautiful place.
The the hikes that you took in Southeast Oregon, which is a part of the state that I love. It's interesting. I think about the two kind of the Willamette Valley, and our area is the gorge is absolutely amazing, but Northeast Oregon and Southeast Oregon for some reason are kind of like magnets for me. I don't know what it is. I mean,
Same here.
they're so
They're
so
away.
yeah, they're just completely different. I mean, it's hard to imagine two different kind of biomes in the
Yeah.
same state. Um, and you talk about the Wallowas, and having that as almost like a backpacking region. It really does function so well. Um, in your on your website, you have some hikes that you had to cut from your book, and I'm
Hmm.
interested in kind of talking a little bit about
Okay.
those, and in particular, in Northeast Oregon, you had Big Sheep Basin. Can you talk
Yes.
about that hike?
Okay. So Big Sheep Basin, that hike. So let me back up. So the hike that I included in that area, I actually included two hikes that start at the same trailhead in that area, and that's the trailhead is the Tenderloin Trailhead, which I don't know why it's called that. I think it's a historic road, I believe. And so one of the hikes starting at the Tenderloin Trail, I almost said Timberline, the Tenderloin Trailhead goes to a place called Dollar Lake, Bonnie Lakes, and then Dollar Lake. And this is really cool, beautiful lakes. The top of the Wallowa is like 8,500 feet. And then I did that and I loved it. And then I found myself on the last day of my trip there, last full day, and I wanted to do another hike. And I didn't. My original plan fell through because I was going to go into Hell's Canyon and it was just too hot. I think it was. Just decided that was not a good idea. It was just too hot and didn't feel comfortable doing that by myself because we all have to have limits. And so I decided to go back up into the Wallowas, and so I went back to the Tenderloin Trail and decided I wanted to explore the other trails that went there that I could get to in a day. And the first place I went was Big Sheep Basin. The second place I went was Imnaha Divide. I went two places in one because they branch out from the same trailhead, different trails to go off. And I went to Big Sheep Basin and I thought this is a really beautiful place. I met a couple that was doing trail maintenance while I was there. That was cool. And it was a really beautiful place. I thought, wow, this is really neat. I have to put this in my book. And then I went back to the main trail, the Tenderloin Trail, and I had a little bit of extra time. I like to do, sometimes when I'm doing research, I'll do 2 or 3 hikes in a day. I'll do like 15, 16, 17 miles because summer days I have the whole day. I'm a morning person, so I'll get on the trail by 8 o'clock in the morning. And so anyway, I went to Amnaha Divide, and it blew me away so thoroughly that I thought, well, I can't include Big Sheep Basin and Amnaha Divide. That's just too much. I can't have 3 hikes in the same trailhead. So Big Sheep Basin just missed the cut. But it's a really, really neat place. You don't have views of the rest of the Willows when you're there. You're in a basin below these like kind of striped orangish red mountains, and there's a couple of creeks that run through it, and the trail is really faint in a couple of spots too, which is the other reason why I cut it. I decided that one thing I try to avoid really faint trails for the most part. I thought I wanted things to be accessible for people. But Big Sheep Basin is a great place if you're more of an adventurer and you want to go and just have a place where you're not going to encounter pretty much anybody. I like when I met the 2 people that were there, I thought, wow, cool. I didn't expect to see anybody. Then I saw they had trail maintenance gear with them. And I thought, great. All right.
You also mentioned in Southeast Oregon, I was really pleased to see Pike Creek because, I mean, the Alvord Desert, if you've never been to the Alvord Desert, I mean, it is just a spectacular place to go. And that has got probably the best view of that whole area. I mean, it's just laid out, and it reminds me of parts of Southern California. It's very, very similar. But the hike that I was interested in, that I've wanted to take before, is Wild Horse Lake. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, that's in my book. So that's actually a fun story. I have a lot of fun stories from working in this book. So Wild Horse Lake was the last hike I completed for this book, the very last, number 125. And so last September, my wife and I went to Europe for a week and a half. We went to Belgium and France, because I love France, and Belgium and Amsterdam. And we got back, and 2 days later, I went out to Southeast Oregon. I was already very tired, jet lagged. And during that time, I did the last 6 hikes for this book. I stayed in the lookout tower near the Strawberry Mountains. And so the weather being the weather, one thing about Southeast Oregon is that in the middle of summer, great, but it's hot. But if you go in the off season, it's even more spectacular, but the weather is iffier. So I thought, I need to get to this area before the weather turns bad. Well, so I ended up having to leave my lookout tower a day early, which is, I don't want to say heartbreaking, but it was really a bummer to have to leave this beautiful lookout tower, Fall Mountain, that I'd reserved a day early just so I could get to the Owyhee, because you cannot go to the Owyhee if the roads are wet. You can't. It's a terrible idea. So anyway, I went to the Owyhee, but because I had to go to the Owyhee, I had to throw my entire schedule off to get to the Owyhee Canyonlands once. After I'd already gotten rained out of the Owyhee Canyonlands a previous trip where I had to redo a different trip, where I had to change my plans again. So anyway, this is to get to Wild Horse Lake. Because I'd thrown my entire trip out of whack, the way I'd organized it, because just to get to this one place, I ended up having to go to Steens Mountain at a different time than I was planning on, as I planned on finishing in the Owyhee. So when I went to Steens Mountain, I was done with 124 hikes, needed one more. And as I drove up Steens, I drove into the snow. And I got to near the top of Steens Mountain. It was like half mile from the summit trailhead. And it was snowing. And it was 32 degrees or 31 degrees and complete whiteout conditions. And I thought, I really want to be done with this book. Should I just go do it? And then I thought, but I'm not going to see anything. So I called my wife back in Burns. I went back to Burns. I called my wife, and she said, no, I know you want to be done with this. We need to go back a different day and finish that hike. You have to have this hike in your book. And I said, I know, I just don't, I'm ready to be done. I need to be done with this. And she said, no, you need to go back and do it. I was just kind of over the whole thing. So I drove back up to Steens the next day. The sun was out. There was like a half inch of snow on the ground. The road was fine. And It was beautiful. It was like 80 and sunny, and there was snow on the ground. I've never seen anything like it. So, hike down to Wild Horse Lake. You have to get there. You have to drive all the way to the summit of Steens Mountain and then hike from there. And it was just perfect. The fall color had started to really shine in the basin, and you could look up and see a bit of snow on the cliffs above because it had snowed the night before. And it was the perfect way to end this trip, the perfect way to end the book. It was one of those, like, one other thing, when you take a project this huge, you're bound to eventually get discouraged a little bit, like, oh, I'm tired, I'm done, I want to be done. But I'm glad that, you know, after talking to my wife, she talked me into not just giving up and saying it's not going to happen. And I credit her for so much for this. But I knew she was right. I was just like ready to throw in the towel because I was tired. But going to Wild Horse Lake was that was like the cherry on the sundae. It was like one of the most perfect places. I mean, where else are you going to find a mountain lake at 8,500 feet at the edge of the desert? Not anywhere else in Oregon. That is the only one. And it was really, really awesome.
Well, and that's I think a great reminder that, you know, the diversity of locations in the state, you know, when you are sort of feeling like you're at your last, you know, you've got your last little bit of reserve, getting out and visiting these places is just, it's kind of like, it's the best way to recharge your battery.
Yeah.
And
I didn't even mention the Oregon Redwoods. I thought I was going to, and I forgot. Yeah. Oregon has redwoods right in the very, very southwestern tip, right above the California border. There are redwoods. Oregon Redwoods. That's another one of those places that, like, I didn't realize until I didn't really think about it until I got down. I'm like, we have redwoods. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if you're down in that part of California and you drive up, you know, into Brookings and Bandon, I mean, you'll see them. Yeah. But again, it's the same sort of thing. Like, oh wait, it's a sort of a different biosphere.
Yeah.
It's very unusual.
And Hell's Canyon is just one of the most remarkable places anywhere, and people don't go there because there's a steep curve to get in there, and just it's there's so many things to see.
Well, one of the other hikes I know that didn't make the cut in your book, and it was actually the very first hike that I used from this book, and I think I maybe even mentioned it to you when you came and did your program, was Indian Mountain, which I just love that hike. I love it to death, and it's one of the few places that there are about half a dozen hikes in Oregon that I just kind of, I mean, you can't, you know, not share them, right? But there's there's like, it just has a different kind of place for me, and Indian Mountain is one of those places.
And it's in the gorge, but it's also in the Cascades. It's kind of in between.
Yeah,
I included Chenadere Mountain in my book instead because it's a little easier to follow the trail.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to do something I hadn't included before, and so I went to Chenadere on my birthday, on my 40th birthday.
Nice.
It was my 40th birthday. I went to Chenadere on my 40th birthday. That was my birthday hike. And I really, really loved it. And so hence I decided, okay, no, we're doing this instead of Indian. But Indian, all the hikes, all the peaks in that Wadham Lake area are beautiful. Chenadere, Tom Lake, and Indian. They're all gorgeous. Yeah. Buck Peak also a little bit further south of there.
Yep. And the place at Indian Mountain, when you kind of come up that crest and you look to the north, and it's just
across the gorge.
On a clear day, it's spectacular.
It's spectacular.
And it is actually a remarkably accessible hike. I think the hardest part about that hike is getting down from the trailhead or from the parking lot to the trailhead
down to the lake. Yeah,
you've got to kind of clamber down those
how many, I forget. I counted them once, and I'm forgetting. I'm blanking on how many steps it is, but it's a lot.
And they're big, and they're railroad ties, and it's just, and then you think, I got to climb back up this thing.
Yeah.
Although the last time we went, we took the service road, which was also kind of a weird way to get there, but absolutely spectacular. And as I said, that was the very first hike I did in your book because I had heard about it, and I was like, I want to figure out how to get there. And this is like, okay, that was a great way to inaugurate the book. We could talk about these hikes all day long. Yeah. We really could. And I just want to urge everybody. These are great resources. Matt's books are great resources for identifying those hikes. They are impeccably cataloged, and I mean, they're fail safe. There's no way not to make these hikes because they are so carefully described, and they include topo maps and
QR codes that work now. You can actually hold your phone over it with the new books. You can actually hold your phone over the QR codes, and it'll pull up the maps you can download.
Yeah. So take advantage of hikes, whether you want to hike in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington, whether you want to hike in the area around Portland, or whether you want to hike around the state. Take advantage of these books. And also Mount Jefferson. They are just really great resources. And it's such a pleasure, Matt, to have you here to share your love of the state with us and your passion for being outdoors and hiking these amazing trails. So
thank you so much, Bob. And it's been a pleasure to do this. I really, really enjoyed it.
So again, thanks everybody for joining us on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Now your assignment is to get out.
Yeah, go hiking.
Go hiking.
I'm going hiking tomorrow.
Nice.
Hopefully everybody can.
Where are you going?
I'm doing I lead hikes for the Mazamas in my spare time. I really enjoy being a part of the Mazamas, the hiking and climbing club. And so tomorrow I'm doing a hike along a very obscure ridgeline northeast of Mount Hood called Mill Creek Ridge. It's an area I really love, and I want to do a little bit of very light trail maintenance, not getting some debris off the trail, and building a couple cairns to help people guide them across this ridgeline. Because that's one thing about some trails. Some trails are overcrowded, but some trails don't get used enough and are in danger of disappearing. And I've taken, hence why my website is Off the Beaten Trail PDX, and that's why it was my first book. I have a special affinity for the obscure trails. So,
well, thanks again, Matt. Thanks again, Matt, so much for joining us today. And remember, folks, you can always watch online on our YouTube channel, and Facebook also archives, but it's a little hard to find things on Facebook, so stick to YouTube. And get out and enjoy these trails. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. We'll hang out a little bit once we're done. We can debrief. Everybody else, have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon.
Happy trails.
Happy trails, right.